Okay, I believe it's just after 12 o'clock. I would like to thank our guests for their willingness to participate in this discussion. A number of our MBA students have indicated that they will be attending today, and we have a number of staff members. And there are also indication of people from government and the private sector. So we have quite a nice mix of people with a vested interest in understanding what the president said in the SONA of 2026. And to me, it was there will always be the usual criticism that the president has created a lot of committees and institutions that have to, in some other way, make the difficult decisions than that one would assume the president or the cabinet themselves will be making. But I have seen a number of things where the president has actually made a few difficult decisions, but we'll get to that a little bit later. I just want to introduce my guest today, Shanisha Pakirisamy. I hope I announced that or pronounced that correctly, Shanisha, but thank you very much. It's your second time here at the business school, much appreciated. An old hand, Dawie Rood, he's been here a few times. I think when the suggestion was made that we asked Dawie, it was because we want to rattle the cage a little bit, and he doesn't need any encouragement to do that. And then Claude Dubisak, he himself is a bit of a handful sometimes in these discussions. I think we've been together at the mining Indaba a year or so ago, and he made an impression as a lateral thinker and somebody perhaps that present a different challenge in the discussion on governance and the economy. So thank you very much for all of you for being here. I'm going to start by asking Dawie Rood. Dawie, from a monetary and a fiscal perspective, your first impressions of the president's speech last week, Thursday. What would you say?
Thanks, Professor. Do I have to limit it to monetary and fiscal, or can I give you just sort of a starting impressions as well?
Yes, please do so.
Yeah, okay. Well, my first impressions were actually quite positive. I think it's one of the better speeches that I've listened to the president. I think he identified most of the major issues in South Africa. I think the kind of solutions that he proposed are quite realistic, quite achievable, quite possible to implement. So yes, my first impressions were actually, well, more positive than negative. The president, of course, he gave us a bit of when it comes to the economy, gave us a bit of an intro. And broadly speaking, again, I agree with the president. Things like, for example, the economy has been growing for about 4 quarters now in a row. You're talking about the primary surplus. He's talking about credit upgrades. All of those things are true. He's talking about inflation on a low side, which is also true. A stronger rand, JSE doing very well. Load shedding referred to that. Private sector participation in the ports and the railways, all of that are certainly and of removal of the grey list and lower inflation targets. All of that the president referred to, which are all true, of course. And in fact, if you go back for about the last year or so, the South African financial markets, and I just want to stress this, the financial markets did very, very well. And I think there are some external reasons for that, some internal reasons. Some internal reasons are things like being removed from the grey list. The fact that we've got low inflation targets, I think that's a big thing. We should actually talk quite a lot about that. The solutions that the president, like I've said, are proposing for things like the local authorities, the water issues, the police and so on, I think all of those are implementable. I think it can be done. And I think that if you actually go ahead and you implement those sort of things, it can make a big difference to those problems that we have in South Africa. But, and this is a very important big but the president was quite selective in his time frame. His time frame is only for the last couple of months, or at most for the last year. If you go back a little bit longer, last 10 or 15 years, then things look completely different in South Africa. Then we're talking about the economy that is hardly growing. It is still not growing, by the way. If you talk about positive economic growth, or 1 or 1.2%, that's hardly something to write home about. But anyway, so the past 10, 15 years on a per capita basis, we've been getting poorer. For the past 10, 15 years, the fiscal accounts have collapsed. For the past 15 years, the local authorities have basically been ran into the ground financially, operationally, state-owned enterprises, and just about all of that. And the reason why we are here today, the primary reason why those things, those bad things happened to the South African economy is simply because the dominant political party in South Africa the past 30 years, in fact, has been the ANC government. The ANC government, the ANC is the reason why we are where we are today. And my biggest concern listening to the president is that he's got all these plans, he's identified all the problems, and the plans, like I've said, I broadly agree with him. Will the guys that got us into this mess, will they actually get us out of this mess? And I don't think so. So that's my biggest issue with the whole speech, is that nothing with the content of the speech, I think, is more or less right. The problem is that the people running the country, that's the problem. The president simply couldn't get himself so far to admit that it is their fault that the country is where it is. And talking about 4 quarters of economic growth, when the economy is growing at 1 or just over 1%, that certainly is not something to be very happy about. So there are a couple of intro comments, Pete.
So, Nisha, I differ from Davie in one respect, and that is I thought that the president actually was quite honest about the problems, and there's no doubt who he blames for the problems. He's been doing that for a number of years now, saying that we are the reason why we are where we are financially. But let me just ask you a question that I've been asking a lot of people lately, in the media at least, is do we have the revenue base, the tax base? Do we have the tax base to recover from in terms of infrastructure, governance? Can we recover from here based on the capital that we have in the tax base? Because if I look at what the expectation is that Minister Enoch Godongwana will read his budget a couple of weeks from now, he will probably not have more money available to assist local governments to get out of the infrastructure problems that they have, and provincial government and the foot and mouth. He won't have money to throw at the problem. Where are we going to get the money from if we assume we don't have the tax base? And Minister Godongwana certainly don't have any room for further borrowing, I would say.
I think that's the key question in the room, Pitt. We are sitting with a still constrained fiscus. I would say that the fiscal dynamics have turned a bit more favorably in the last couple of months. South Africa has been gifted once again with a commodity price windfall. So the things that we dig out of the ground and export have gone up in their value, such as gold and platinum. And what we predominantly import, and to a large degree, that's oil. Those prices have been largely capped because of the global oil supply glut. And that could lead us to a better than expected outcome on our revenues. But as you mentioned, it's really not enough for this very long list of competing priorities on the social front for South Africa. And the key really is to start including the private sector more and more. And, Davie mentioned a couple of issues that have turned a bit more favorably for government and the country as a whole. I think the one addition there is that, through reform measures such as Operation Vulindlela, which really focuses on the network industries, and very importantly, to your point, Pitt, doesn't necessarily mean it's a drag on the fiscus, but that was really just to ensure that we can cut that regulatory red tape and to find out where those structural bottlenecks were in terms of furthering the reform momentum in areas of energy, water, logistics, and a couple of others there. And so I think integrating the private sector into some of these key socioeconomic reforms then does enable additional funding, but also technical know-how. So I think that's really the key in terms of solving this problem. I think government realizes it doesn't have the technical know-how. It certainly doesn't have the funding to do so. And so by liberalizing some of these sectors to include more private sector participation, that's really how we are going to anchor a higher growth rate in South Africa in order to meet some of those socioeconomic demands. And we know that that list is growing from things like NHI and a number of other social reforms outside of what you've mentioned in terms of local municipality overhaul.
But let me just stay with you for a minute. Why do we assume that the private sector will necessarily have the capital to come to the party and to resolve our infrastructure issues, for instance? That's the one question. And the other one is, and I think I want to ask Davie that, but you can also give me your mind about that, is that do we have the policy regime, in other words, the legislation and the macroeconomic policies in place to encourage private sector investors to invest and to take the risk for investing in our infrastructure? And can we reward them for taking that risk sufficiently to encourage them to participate?
We saw a sniff of encouragement coming out of the private sector towards the end of last year when there were 2 infrastructure bonds that came into the market and they were oversubscribed, suggesting that there is quite healthy appetite from the private sector to engage in trying to participate in the infrastructure drive for South Africa. So I think that does exist. In terms of whether we will see, further investment coming through, it will depend on the terms and conditions that come with those infrastructure facilities. And I think that we can do it in a way in order to start crowding in the private sector involvement in quite a big way. We know that there are large demands on the asset management base in South Africa, from industrialization to infrastructure, to building corridors into Africa and those transport and logistics networks in order to improve the trade network across Africa. So there are competing priorities in that space as well. But I think what we saw at the back end of last year is some appetite that's coming through from the private sector for that drive for infrastructure.
Darby, maybe you have a better handle on exactly what is the source these bonds, infrastructure bonds that were oversubscribed. Who are those individuals or companies that are willing to take the risk, and where did they get the money from?
I've got a slightly different take on this than Sanisha. I think Sanisha, tell me if you disagree with me, but I think they are typically, for example, institutional investors. It could be pension funds, it could be asset managers, it could be the unit trust industry. So it could be a wide variety of institutional investors. I don't have the specific investors in that, but it's probably just a big variety of various investors buying those bonds. But it doesn't mean, by buying those bonds, it doesn't mean that they are interested in infrastructural investment in South Africa. They're buying a financial asset. And that the money that they pay for that financial asset will be ring-fenced, and it will go to certain infrastructural development by the state. It doesn't mean necessarily that they are very keen to invest in infrastructure in South Africa. But you asked earlier, so where's the money going to come from? That's not an issue. I promise you, Pete, that is certainly not an issue. If you've got a good investment case to make, if you've got good returns to offer, then you will get the money. There are many, many billions of rands lying idle in the banking system in South Africa, belonging to companies in South Africa, and they will be very happy to invest that. The problem is they are probably not going to invest that because, and let me just jump back to what I said earlier. The president referred to what's happening on the financial markets recently, and the markets did very well, and they did very well because of things like inflation targets being lowered, because of the grey list, and also because of international factors. And some of that will spill over into the real economy in the form of, for example, lower interest rates, which will have a positive impact on the economy. But that's unlikely to go much further than that because there are other issues in the economy. It's not money. There are other issues in the economy that still is seen as an obstacle to investments in South Africa. And those obstacles are the things that we all know about. Expropriation, for example, collapsing local authorities, for example, and many, many other things. Can I just make a comment about also the tax base in South Africa? You referred to that earlier. Now, the tax base, yeah, and I have to agree. I think we've turned a corner. Well, perhaps is that a bit of a strong word, but things are not as bad as previously in terms of the fiscal accounts. It seems to me as if the debt levels could be stabilizing within a year or so. We will see next week when the Minister of Finance delivers his budget speech, whether we can actually believe him or not, but there seems to be some improvement there. The improvements has to do with a couple of things. Remember just one thing, that the Minister of Finance depends on a growing economy to get enough revenue. If the economy doesn't grow, the Minister of Finance can't get money. And now he can't get enough money. He hasn't been getting enough money recently because he's got a long list of things on which he needs to spend money. That long list of things is just getting longer and longer. And we can go through the new list of things that the president announced in the State of the Nation. So since the economy is not growing fast enough to provide all this cash, the only alternative, unfortunately, there is this bit of a windfall from the commodity cycle. The only other alternative is to put huge pressure on SARS to squeeze as much as you possibly can out of a very, very narrow tax base in the economy. And that's exactly what SARS is doing. SARS is exceptionally aggressive the last couple of Well, they more and more so the last couple of years. And that also means that you chase a lot of potential taxpayers out of the economy. And we see that people going out of the country or simply trying to organize their tax affairs in a very aggressive manner in order to pay as little tax as possible. So you're right. The tax base is basically the economy, and that thing is just not expanding fast enough, and it's unlikely to get bigger to provide sufficient funding to the Minister of Finance as long as we have these wrong macroeconomic policies in place.
Sorry, Dawie, let me just stay for that for a moment at the tax thing. The argument that SARS is squeezing the taxpayer, SARS can only ask what it's due in terms of existing legislation. Can they actually increase taxes arbitrarily?
No, technically you are right. Of course, technically you are right. They can't take more than what the law allows them to do. But there's a way of doing it. They can be very aggressive. They can ask for audits all the time. They can do. There are many things that they can still do in order to make life really very difficult for the taxpayer in South Africa. So yes, within the law, and if you've got a lot of money, you can take them to court. And quite often, the taxpayer certainly do go to court, and quite often they're the winners when they actually go to court. But to fight the state, to fight SARS, is very difficult. That's a powerful machine that's going to make your life extremely difficult.
Lord, welcome. I'm glad to see you at last.
I've been here for a little while. I've been listening to Dawie. I was very worried about him at first. He started agreeing with the president. Thank goodness he recovered quickly.
Okay, Claude, why don't you react a little bit to this part, this last argument of Dawie about the taxman? Because I still think that the fact that the taxman is bureaucratically efficient in the sense that it demands what it is due, you can't be blamed for that. If we want to complain about higher taxes, we have to look at the treasury and we have to look at the legislature. That's where your problems start. And just recently, Minister Godongwana said to the health minister, I'm not going to give you what you want for the national health insurance, because what you want is, if you remove the tax credits of those who have a medical aid, you squeeze the middle class even further. So you had a degree of a feeling of protectionism vis-a-vis the middle class, at least. So why don't you just tell me what are your views on what Dawie says here?
It's Monday morning and I'm disinclined to get into technical stuff. I'm sorry, Pete. It's just that, we can talk about, these marginal tax rate issues, and we can talk about the marginal number of taxpayers and the fact of the matter, or the marginal growth rates, or the fact of the matter is that, as Dawie said, this is a depleted economy from a structural standpoint. So there is nothing new under the sun. Ramaphosa's ninth SONA. What has he achieved? He's delivering 1.2% growth, and we have to celebrate that. It brings to mind, sorry, I'm completely ignoring your question because I don't think it's particularly interesting question. Sorry, Pete, you might never invite me again, but so be it.
I'm brave. I can take all the nonsense you can give.
Yeah, the thing is, marginal tax rate, marginal growth rate, marginal this, marginal that. The big story for me of the State of the Union was that it is indeed his ninth, and that he's delivered 1% growth. And the bigger story was that right before that, he had to appoint his deputy president to go fix the water crisis, as if it was, goodness gracious, we have a water crisis in South Africa. This is a new emergency, and we must put all hands on deck. And it's very grave. And, it reminds me of when Ramaphosa was appointed by Zuma in charge of fixing Eskom. What are we talking about? We're talking about...
Claude, I just want to, if you call my question dull, you have to come up with an interesting answer. I don't see that yet. So let me ask you the question that you focus on.
I'm struggling with an interesting answer because I think, I'm struggling with an interesting answer because there was no interesting question.
Okay, good. Let me ask you this then. If we have 1% growth in the economy, You can give me this generalized type of answer. Yeah, well, we don't have the right policies in place, and we don't have the capital to invest in infrastructure, whatever the reason may be. But if you were the president and you are giving your first SONA, and you want to ensure that whatever you say will in some other way encourage sufficient number of people to come and invest in the South African economy to make a real difference, because that's, I assume that investment will lead to growth. Just give me a little bit of a speech. You're the president now. What would you do? What would you say to South Africans, given where we are? We don't have the infrastructure. We probably don't have the time. We don't have the tax base. Take into consideration all those variables, which makes it hardly possible to frame a positive scenario for economic growth. And then you tell me, what would you have said if you were the president that will made Claude say today, you can't believe it, at last,
I would say something that the
speeches.
ANC has never said. I would say something that the ANC has never said and doesn't want. Put people to work. The greatest asset in South Africa is its vast underutilized population.
But how do you do it? Tell me how you do it.
You have to start by deregulating the labor market. You have to start incentivizing people to get to work. You have to incentivize businesses to hire people. And you have to start by doing away with collective bargaining. You have, in that sense, you have to open up the economy. You have to lower the cost of hiring and firing people. And you're going to say, yeah, but that's not going to create investment. No, but nothing is going to create investment magically when you don't, fundamentally change the rules of the game. And so you have to deregulate this economy, but at the same time, you have to improve competition so that you take away the cartelization of the economy. The problem is that you have a political economy that is biased against labor-intensive industries because it benefits politically the ANC, because the ANC support is rural and mostly underclass people who depend on the social welfare system. The per capita greatest social welfare system in the world. And economically, you have an alliance with white monopoly capital, where these guys effectively control the service economy, the banking sector, the insurance sector, the healthcare sector, the retail sector, the insurance sector, which is, if you look at the constitution of the JSE, this now represents about 70% of the JSE. So this is the thing we don't want to talk about. We don't want to talk about the fact that there is an alliance of convenience between what they call white monopoly capitalism, where we apportion part of that to Black economic empowerment and to Black employees, to form a social redistribution, for what is fundamentally a growth-destroying, investment-destroying, rent recycling political economy. It is meant to exclude the vast majority of South Africans from the economy. They are just made into, taxpayers and consumers.
Shanisa, these two gentlemen keep on telling me what the problem is. What would you have done? What is the solution? How do we get 1% or 3% economic growth from 1%? What did Trevor Manuel and Thabo Mbeki did differently? Why did they get 4% and Ramaphosa battles with 1%?
So, Piet, maybe I can backtrack a little just to present some other sides of the argument. So in terms of the infrastructure, I know we're going back a bit, but infrastructure as an asset class does provide some diversification when you are in the asset management industry. So we are now, entering an environment where real assets hold value. It does diversify against your traditional allocation to bonds and equities. So infrastructure and commodity-related products in a world where resource imperialism is being revived in a very strong way by the new US administration, I think holds value in a portfolio. Is it going to be a large chunk? I mean, obviously you wear your risk hat when you put that on into your portfolio, but I think there is space for that coming through. And of course, when portfolios were allowed to invest in more infrastructure, there was appetite that came through. I think the market even has a very strong appetite for things like green bonds. The pivot here is that those finances need to be ring-fenced and go directly into the projects in order to become a viable investment opportunity. Also going back to your original question, which was, what did the SONA actually deliver? Was it good or bad? I think it also needs to be viewed in the context of who was the reader or listener to the SONA. So, if you were a business participant, what were you looking out for? Were you looking for more information about South Africa's stance on foreign policy in order to further export growth in a world where protectionist policies have started to take over, constraining global trade? Also within that kind of industrialization base, and I think this is kind of where business and labor meet up, and Claude mentioned this, to find, were there enough announcements for the labor intensive industry? So, I mean, something, that I think was a big elephant in that SONA room was essentially the whittling away of South Africa's industrialization base. There was a Business Leadership South Africa, their weekly newsletter that said that 22% of our vehicle imports are now coming through from China. So I think that was a big elephant in the room that wasn't fully addressed. I mean, they did make mention of trying to protect labor in these industries, but no very strong direction really came out from that. So I think, that was essentially what labor was looking for. Civil society, I think, was looking for some solutions on combating crime, accountability for those that have been found guilty. And have we furthered any of those anti-corruption measures? So I think it really depends on, who you were listening to the SONA. Did you get that information back? I think what was a bit better than what we've seen in previous years is that's a bit of a further step from the national dialogue that was started last year. And so I think there was a bit more of a cohesive approach from representation of the different parties. I mean, you often hear the parties talking after the SONA, what did they like in the SONA, what didn't they like? And I feel like there was less criticism this time around. I mean, the DA said, they could have furthered the talk on reforms. And that's true. I mean, we know that their focus right now is the network industries. And we know that with Operation Vulindlela, it's not a hammer to hit all nails. So we are trying to focus on that. You ask about, how do we fix the labor market? I think, even before we get to some of those liberalization of the labor market reform, I think we really also need to fix the education base. And I mean, Piet, you in this area, you'll know how many students applied for university positions and those not being available for a number of students, potential students this year. So I think we even need to go back one step further. There were, of course, a number of reforms that were announced in order to promote early childhood development, but I think it needs to be done at scale. So even with the labor programs that have been announced, the employment works program, the youth employment incentive schemes, these are pockets of employment growth, but it needs to be done on scale in order for us to get the 2% to the 3%. I also, as a last point, I see Claude has his hand up, as a last point, just to say that we shouldn't become too short-termism when we're talking about economic growth. We have been in a torrid period. You asked, what did Trevor Manuel do? He didn't spend on infrastructure. And this is why our gross fixed capital formation ratio to GDP is sitting under 15%, where the global average outside of China is sitting at 25%, and the National Development Program goal for 2030 is sitting at 30%. So we had a long period where there was a period of serial underinvestment, even within the private sector, and you can even argue to the point of capital stripping. And so when that investment comes back, there's going to be a period of, repair and maintenance before we get new expansionary capex to come on board. So I think, thinking about, growth kind of at around 1%, we need to assess the SONA on the basis of, have we actually seen enough reform elements being presented there so that structurally we can then move to an economy that can print above 2%. I think 3% in the next 5 years is a bit pie in the sky, given that our fixed investment has not yet really been, fired up. And I think in all honesty, it will probably only really come through from 2027. Last year, we saw a number of economists saying that growth was going to be higher. Why? Because they expected that fixed investment growth rate to come through quite strongly. And then, of course, the policy credibility failed. And on the back of that, before the government of national unity really got on a firmer footing, those projects are now being delayed and pushed out. So I think, in the logistics space, even if private sector signed up, there is still a bit of a lead time for those companies to start operating on the railway system of Transnet, as an example. So that's really only 2027 stories. I think longer term, we can be a bit more ambitious for 3%. If I look at the 5-year time frame, I think something with a 2% handle looks a little bit more realistic in the context of the direction of policy, the context of policy credibility, and of course, operating in an election cycle as we now go from local government elections in 2027, 2026, all the way into what we're going to see out of the ANC at the back end of 2027 and who that new political leader will be, and the shape of the government of national unity thereafter. I'll leave it there so that Claude can respond. I think he had his hand up earlier.
Claude, please go ahead.
Look, I mean, this is all great, Sanisha, and a lot of what you said is true and well and good. But your last statement contradicts the anti-penultimate one. You talk about achieving 3-4%, in the next 5 years, given the kind of confidence in the policy environment and the results of investment by Operation Vulindlela. But then you raise the fact that, we have fundamental political leadership changes coming to the ANC. And this is the problem I have with, I'm sorry, and it's not something I'm going to say against you, but it's a problem I have with economists, is that there's always that kind of externalization of the political landscape and kind of reification and objectification of the economy as if it's something that functions on its own. We have to recognize that that's not the case. It was never the case, and it's even less the case now that we have this new Trumpian reality. The business cycle in South Africa has been dead for about 10 years, and every growth forecast that I've looked at, including Treasury, has been proven wrong over and over again. If we had grown by the expected consensus growth forecast of the 2 to 3 years, South Africa would be twice the size it is now. It's in terms of the economy. We don't seem, economists and frankly business people don't seem to be able to understand the political economy system which they have. And therefore they keep on misreading the policy signal, and they keep on, for instance, a misreading of the policy signal is to mistake Operation Vulindlela for structural reform, which it is not. It is merely stabilization of basic network industries that should not have been destroyed in the first place. So, and we go, and this is a conversation I've had with big business for a long time. And, I say to them 3-4 years ago, guys, you need to start paying really serious attention to the water crisis. And they say, but, we have our hands full with electricity and Transnet and crime. And I say the crisis isn't waiting for you. Reality isn't polite. It doesn't conform to your attention span and to your intellectual predilections and to your preferences and to your political, blank spots. Until and unless we have the capacity and the willpower and the courage and the honesty and the integrity to deal with the reality we have, we will not be growing. Yet this is a country that can grow. I mean, how can we talk about, I had an extraordinary event. I was at an event where someone spoke about the potential of South Africa in AGOA exports. I said, what did you smoke this morning? We are on the verge of a collapse in the diplomatic relationship with the United States, a critical investor in South Africa and a critical trading partner. And we don't seem to be able to have an honest political national conversation about it, where one part of the ANC is going, yeah, bring it on, Trump, we are China's best friends, while the other ones are just signaling that hopefully we still get AGOA. To grow this economy is going to need an entirely new political dispensation. That entirely new political dispensation still needs to be born.
Claude, let me, Dawie, I've seen something. And I would like you to respond to that. Around about December last year, suddenly Minister Jose Enzo Ramokgopa and Eskom changed the perceived regime that will work best in terms of the privatization of parts of Eskom. And suddenly they changed it, and the president has reset it during this SONA. And the next day, Eskom issued a statement saying, yes, the president's presumptions about this is spot on. In other words, the president made a very difficult decision to change something that has happened amongst the minister and Eskom.
What was difficult about that, Pet? That was
no,
the
I'm not saying
idea.
It's difficult. I'm not saying it's difficult, but it's a good thing that he did that, didn't he?
Of course, that's a good
imagine he
idea,
just let it be.
You know, last week, now this illustrates what we have beautifully. Panyaza Lesufi last week told us that he goes to the hotels to have a nice shower. That illustrates exactly what we have in our ANC leadership. They don't care. If you ask me what we need to fix in South Africa, we have to get rid of the ANC. It is really as simple as that. Coming back to your specific question about Eskom. Right, what happened? The idea was to break Eskom into 3 pieces. Everybody accepted that, and they started this whole process to break Eskom, to break it up in a transmission and distribution and a generation part, which is all fine. That's what economists have been asking for. We were asking for more than that. Then about a week or 2 ago, the Minister of Electricity said, no, what's going to happen now, the transmission part will still be under control of Eskom. So he changed the whole plan. And he did that because that is what his ideology tells him. That is what the ANC do. They want to keep control over things. And then the president came and the State of the Nation, he said, no, we're going back to plan A again. We're going to break Eskom into 3 pieces again. So I don't know who convinced who here. I don't know whether there was actual discussions behind closed doors. I don't know what happened here. But clearly, the default position of the ANC to take control over things and to run it around. We're not going to fix this country as long as we have the ANC as part of the political elite in South Africa. The people that are looked after in South Africa are the well-connected individuals, are the senior political leaders, are the people with jobs, and preferably people that belong to COSATU, are the civil servants that are overpaid and underworked.
Okay, Darby, but one can phrase this thing a little bit differently as well. The business model of this privatization business model, it doesn't suit Eskom. We have to admit it will erode the existing capacity to balance the books, and it is possible to argue, well, then good, that should be so. The benefits on the other side is significant. Then the second thing one can argue is that the president responded to individuals in the private sector who had already committed themselves to investing in Eskom. And that wait, let me just finish. And that he's spoken to them, and he said, and they spoken to him, and he said, no, that's exactly what should be happening. And what he's done is, remember, Kgoshensha Ramokgopa didn't present this new plan to cabinet. He just announced it. So the president reset it. That's his job, to take leadership and to reset things when the ministers go wrong, and they will often do. I think if we,
Yeah, Peter, okay, let me ask you. Now, who was the captain of the so-called war room when Eskom started collapsing? It was Cyril Ramaphosa himself. Do you think he came with a plan to break Eskom into smaller pieces? Do you think it was a president's plan to get private sector participation in electricity and in the harbors and the railroads? It was not the president's plan. What happened is that the ANC destroyed those institutions, and they get private sector participation, not because it's what they believe in. They simply do that because they have no choice. That is why it's happening. The president's heart is not there. The president's heart is not there. His heart is not with private sector participation. His heart is with control.
Okay. Sanisa, I'm more optimistic about this thing. I think it's been more complicated. But what are your views of what is happening there? And what are the benefits of it?
Okay, so a few points here. When we talk about, I completely agree with Claude. You know, we come from an era where markets traded on economic fundamentals. We have now shifted to an era where markets are trading on changes in the geopolitical sphere. That is not a South African thing. That is a global thing. We've seen that global markets, sometimes ignore labor data, inflation data, but they react when Trump, captures the leader of Venezuela. So geopolitical tools are becoming instrumental in being able to forecast financial markets, and it's causing a lot of volatility. And we need to be quite aware of that. I think Dawie also touches, he said it a couple of times around the political elite. South Africa used to be a market where the divisions were very strongly racially based. But I think they're becoming more based on the political elite and the rest that have been left behind. And again, this is not a South African only situation. We're seeing this playing out in a global scale. This is why we've had the rising populist leaders across a number of European economies, Latin America, which is now shifting to the right. We're seeing it coming out of America. And that's why there's such strong support for some of the policies that are very populist driven on immigration to solve for those ills that citizens did not gain from in democratic environments. Saying that, when we bring it back to South Africa and how this fits in with policy here, we also need to remember why Operation Vulindlela was started. And we also know that they completed their first 5-year term. A very big chunk of that was even before the government of national unity came about, when we were still under, the full rule of the African National Congress. So I think saying that all the reforms are going to fall away if the political situation of the coalition changes, it may not be correct, given that some of these reforms were actually started before we had the government of national unity, with the influence of the Democratic Alliance and a number of other parties to counter the African National Congress. So, will all of the policies continue? Probably not. So as Dawie points out, sometimes it is 2 steps forward and 1 step back. And government has been pushed into a corner. So there are still a number of individuals within government that do not believe that private sector is the way to go. But even they would have to come on board now, because the government just doesn't have the financing, which is, originating from one of the other questions about how is government going to pay for all of this. That point of reckoning, I think, has come where they now acknowledge that they do need the assistance of the private sector, both for the knowledge base, but also for the funding base. Claude also touched, quite a lot on foreign policy. So I think my argument is coherent in terms of, in the next couple of years, we can get a 2% growth handle because of some of the reforms that we're seeing, unlocking gains in the network industries that will allow some private sector participants to come through with new projects and new jobs growth on the back of some delivery outcomes that we see there. The 3% plus, that is, we need to see quite a lot more happening, broader than just the network industry. We have to see government being far more consistent on policy. So we can't have 2 different government departments, suggesting very different outcomes on the same policy, which is exactly what has happened in the electricity ministry, whether it's going to be state control that really rules transmission, or if it's going to be privatized in a bigger way. Foreign policy in South Africa is lagging the global trend, and we don't have enough individuals that are, supporting South Africa's ambitions to reorganize its trade routes in this world where global supply chains are reorganizing. I mean, we all heard the speech by Mark Carney at the World Economic Forum about, this being the potential for middle powers to emerge. This could be South Africa's moment, but we don't have enough foreign policy representatives. We don't have ambassadors in countries that are furthering the trade agenda. I think that's one of the reasons that in the next 5 years, we probably won't get 3% growth, because foreign policy has become a far bigger angle to consider when trying to rev up the growth engine in South Africa.
Just one thing, Shanisa, before we go on. It seems like everybody talks about the industrialization of South Africa and industrial policies, but I think the point has been made that South Africa industrialization is never going to happen, because our supply and value chains can't compete internationally with the Chinese, the Asians, the Americans, the Canadians. We can't compete. We have to get the strength in our economy from somewhere else. Is that a valid argument? And if it is, where will our strength come from, if I can use that biblical expression? Where will we get the growth from? I know mining is probably the one that we will moot quite often, but where else will we get economic growth from?
It's a realistic argument that you make, Pitt. So, the deindustrialization of South Africa happened even before the cheap Chinese imports. I mean, The manufacturing industry is now suffering from electricity costs that have gone up enormously over the last couple of years. They are now, in conjunction with that, contending with cheaper inputs from markets that have cheaper labor. They don't have the stringent labor regulations that Claude pointed out earlier in our conversation. And of course, the currency strengthening doesn't help our South African exporters. That's more of an argument to say that South African consumers benefit from cheaper imports rather than our South African exporters benefiting in that kind of world. We need to fire growth engines on other fronts. So you need to have business confidence coming back. And I think this is where we are stuck in that short-termism growth, sticking at 1%, but longer term, some of the structural reform measures suggest that we can get a higher growth rate. We need to improve the operating environment for business. So that means service delivery outcomes from local government level, so that there are operationally services for railway and ports, that the costs come down in terms of our competitiveness relative to the rest of the globe. On the electricity side, and I mean, we talk a lot about the problems that still exist, but we also, need to give credit where it's due. So if we had this webinar 2 years ago, I mean, it was highly likely that one of us would have dropped off because our Wi-Fi stopped because there was no electricity. The energy stability issue coming back has also contributed to some confidence returning in that area. Of course, there are other crises like water availability, water security, the logistics network that is slowly recovering off a very low base. So, we need a couple of things to go right for business confidence to come back, and a very big one there is policy certainty and policy credibility. And I think that's essentially what business looks for in order to invest and to hire new workers in the economy. And, up until this point, we're still seeing contentious issues like the transmission in the electricity sector, where, very recently there was this dispute about whether it's going to be state-controlled or in private sector hands. So as a business, you're going to be very wary of plugging in new infrastructure, hiring new workers in an environment where the political certainty is not there. So I really think that the key to kickstart business confidence, as we measure from institutions like the Bureau of Economic Research, resides in having some policy credibility coming through in a firmer way in order for that fixed investment to be unlocked, in conjunction with gains on local government to ensure that the operating environment is easier for businesses.
Claude, when the Government of National Unity was formed in 2024, there was a bit of an uptick in business investor confidence. The market showed a bit of a positive response to that. Are we better off with the Government of National Unity, and is it actually measurable? Do we know that we are better off?
I'm not convinced. I do not buy the argument that the Government of National Unity has made an enormous difference in terms of the policy environment and has manifested in I was going to say higher growth. I mean, you go from 0% to 1% is really, satisfying oneself with what George W. Bush called the soft bigotry of low expectations. I just wrote a long piece on the structure of the economy and reform in Daily Maverick, and I pointed out, as Tanisha has, to the fact that Operation Vulindlela starts by the ANC in the sheer disaster in which South Africa finds itself during COVID lockdown. And so we have to, things aren't so absolutely binary. There is enough in the ANC of a political will and a need for political survival for doing the bare minimum to ensure that they don't lose more power than they have already, and therefore to do whatever minimal service requirement in reform or turnaround is needed. There is, that's one side. And so with or without the GNU, and assuming that the ANC would have kept Ramaphosa as president and would have managed to cobble a majority in parliament, Operation Vulindlela and what we're seeing would have continued undoubtedly. The GNU and the participation of the DA in the GNU was more of a confidence-related political signal, but it is very clear that the DA was completely outmaneuvered and remains completely outmaneuvered in terms of its participation in the GNU. The only, I would say, policy success that it had was that very strange VAT battle. But to a large extent, it was more symbolic than actual. The more fundamental question is the theory of growth that South Africa has. And there, Pete, I want to answer your question, what must we do to elevate growth? There are no miracles to be expected, and there is no single sector or single opportunity in the very complex environment nationally, domestically, and internationally we are in that is going to suddenly appear out of nowhere. What's really extraordinary about South Africa is that there has been no new story, no new economic sector besides the consumer sectors, right? And the opening liberalization of those sectors, but in very cartel-like manner. There's been no new economic story in South Africa for a long time. We keep on, as Tanisha says, we keep on being saved by the bell of commodity prices. And the truth of the matter is that if you compare export revenues from minerals to the production index for the past 25 years, essentially the mining production index stays below 100. It hasn't grown, so we have not done anything but replacing lost tons and lost ounces of minerals, simply because the industry too, the mining industry too, has been rendered relatively non-competitive. Think about this. In the early 1990s, about 70-80% of global market capitalization in mining was the JSE. Today, it's about 3%. South Africa was the mining giant in the world that created those big conglomerates, including somehow, BHP Billiton and Rio Tinto played a role, either because they were mergers of South African companies that then internationalized, or because South African capital and expertise and captains created those monsters. But they all left the shores. So where is growth going to come from? It's going to come from a number of parallel streams of latent growth and productivity. So getting back the basics, the networks working, right? Fixing the water infrastructure is going to capture massive amount of capital investment, which is available. As Davi said, there is no money problem, whether it's in South Africa or globally. We have a glut of money in the world. The problem is that it goes in the wrong places. And in South Africa, we've been particularly good at turning away from that, because we have a policy environment that simply says to people, we don't want your money. So agriculture has an immense potential, okay? Local regional manufacturing has still a lot of potential on some niche. Agro-processing has enormous amount of potential. Tourism is huge potentially. Back office, offshore services are huge. I think there's 300 or 400,000 jobs in those kind of back office offshoring functions in South Africa. It has potential for 3-4 million. South Africans speak many languages. We are in the same time zone as Europe, between the United States, North America, South America, and Asia. There are lots of niches to be leveraged, which together could get us to, I think you're right, Tanisha, 2.5-3% growth.
Are you still here, Davi? I don't see your picture.
Yeah. Pete. Yeah, can I jump in on one or two things?
Yeah, good. Go ahead.
Okay, well, I agree with Claude. I think agriculture, tourism, mining even, if you can get rid of Gwanemantash, mining is, but a traditional, what we call international
manufacturing. He's on his way out, you should be dancing.
Say again?
He's on his way out. He's announced
but that's
his
a good thing.
retirement.
But Pete, I've listened to my colleagues and to you as well. We're talking about policy certainty. We've got a lot of policy certainty in South Africa. There's no uncertainty about policy. We're talking about the reform of policy changes and so on. Now, here's the problem. Is what we have in South Africa, quite often what happens is that reality overtakes ideology. And then you get policy change. Now, let me give you an excellent example of this. Last year, the governor of the South African Reserve Bank said he's going to target 3% inflation. The Minister of Finance kicked up a huge fuss. He didn't want to target 3% inflation. We can talk about that, why he didn't want to. But eventually, he was forced to accept a 3% inflation target. So that's an example of where reality overtook ideology. The same happens to Eskom. The reality is that the ANC never wanted to break Eskom into smaller parts. They never wanted private sector participation. They never wanted the private sector to get involved in the harbors and the railroads or anywhere like that. But the reality is that they've destroyed those institutions, and the reality is that reality has overtaken ideology, and that is why the private sector is participating in those. The policy in South Africa, we've got very clear policy certainty in South Africa, and the policy certainty is that the ANC wants to control everything for the benefit of the ANC. And as long as they are there, that policy certainty will remain.
Manisha, just was one last thing while we're on mining. It seems to be clear that the cadastre system will be start rolling out and in the mining industry, allowing exploration. I think Bernard Swanepoel this week was very upbeat about the potential for mining in South Africa. The Americans, they sent the biggest delegation ever to the mining indaba in Cape Town. And the ANC has recently, if I have to blame the ANC like Darby do, but they have twisted and tweaked the ideals of the black economic empowerment in exploration, because in an effort to lower the cost of exploration and to lower the risk of exploration. So it seems like it's not only we're relying on the price of commodities in the future. It might be that if there are more exploration, more mining, more job opportunities and expansion of the economy, and with that comes a degree of industrialization, because much of our industrialization is from mining and vehicle manufacturing, etc. So there's some change there, isn't it? It's not as if the ANC is hard-headed and refuse to adjust their policies from time to time. I've seen them in this particular speech. I've seen them change the president changed the policy about Eskom, and I've noticed the policy changes as far as mining is concerned. Can you hear me?
Yeah, Peter, I don't know, I can't hear Sanisha, but you just confirm the point, man.
Okay, now Sanisha, could you hear me?
Yeah, that was for me, Peter. I thought that was in response to Darby. Look, I think when we talk about industrial or re-industrialization in South Africa, I think we also have to be quite aware of the facts that when we look at the structure of the economy and how economic evolution in our developing market counterparts go, is that a bigger portion of the economy becomes services oriented. So, thinking that we're going to have the manufacturing sector as a very large share of GDP in the future, I think we also need to have a realistic hat to say that it will be capped at some point. So, you asked earlier about which of the other sectors are going to promote economic growth. Financial services and personal services have done reasonably well. And so when you look at our GDP data and you look at the primary sector, which is essentially your mining and your agriculture, versus your secondary sector, which is largely manufacturing and a few other bits and bobs in there. And then lastly, your services industry. Your services contribution has actually, been the biggest contributor to overall economic growth in the last while. If you had to look at the evolution of industrialization in a number of our emerging market counterparts, and even if you compare it to some of the large industrialized nations before that, the peak as a share of GDP, we never actually ever reached that peak historically. So we've deindustrialized, but the base it came off was already lower anyway. So I think, in terms of trying to gear up our economy, if we look at where the global markets are going, are we ever going to compete with, and it's not even the Chinas anymore, it's also the Vietnams and the Bangladeshs where labor costs are much lower. Again, coming back to that point of a more rigid labor market, labor costs are structurally higher in South Africa. to try and fire workers after strike is far more difficult. Those kind of conditions already almost preclude South Africa from being a manufacturing giant in the world economy. I think we will not be competitive on the back of electricity prices. Yes, we've sorted out electricity stability, but on electricity prices, the manufacturing sector there already takes the hit. On property-related taxes, we already have that being quite high in South Africa for these firms. And then, of course, the labor component. And I mean, those three make up quite a big contribution to overall cost base of a manufacturing firm in SA. So how do we get to those higher growth levels? And it's not a 5-year time frame. I think this is a much longer structural growth argument, is that we have to gear up the economy in a way that allows services to continue growing as a share of GDP. But that also means that the educational sector and the labor market have to be geared in that way. Otherwise, we risk the point that was coming up in the chat here, that the large pool of unemployed youth becomes even larger because they become even more unemployable in an economic environment that's far more geared to services than the manufacturing or industrial sector. So I think where manufacturing is as a share of GDP, maybe can come up a couple of percentage points on the back of some of the issues that we raise, if we can make the operating environment better for these manufacturing firms. But I think to believe it's going to be the key lever of economic growth in the face of services economy growing globally, I think is a bit of an unrealistic view.
In just more than a week, Minister Godongwana will read his budget. I usually understand the SONA and the president much better after I've listened to Godongwana. I'm dead sure they conspire from time to time. I think we will see a lot more clarity. I want to thank Claude, Dawie, and then Shanisha. Thank you very, very much for being part of the business school's pizza. Much appreciated. I love the fact that Claude has insulted me and that Dawie Rood has abused me verbally. And I love the fact that I agree by and large with Shanisha. It was a lovely conversation. Thank you very much to our guest and our students who attended, and also the people from industry, government, etc. And we see you again at the pizza that deals with the budget speech of Mr. Godongwana. Thank you very much for attending. Goodbye.